Brother Russ.
All right, it is so good to have y'all this morning. Y'all, we have a special speaker this morning, our own Willie Chriesman. Or is it Chriesman? Anyway, come on up, Willie. Okay, you all know him, and he has done encouraging words before. Matter of fact, he started a whole movement after that class. Okay.
He didn't move out of the building, so that's good.
That is a good thing. All right. Willie's father was a Church of Christ preacher in Bessemer, 24th Street Church of Christ. Willie is a news management professional, program director. He's worked in Boston, he's worked in Chicago, he's worked in Birmingham, he's worked in Denver, he's worked in Detroit. But the smartest thing he ever did was to get the lovely, the talented, the saintly Frances Smith to marry him. Now, unfortunately, Frances has never changed her name to Chriesman because she said it was too complicated. But it comes on good sources that they really are married, and she is a librarian in Alabaster. Willie now works as a consultant, freelance, and he gave up the opportunity to produce the Super Bowl to work on his lesson and speak with us this morning, our own Willie Chriesman.
This would be much more fun than working on the Super Bowl, trust me on that. Thank you all for allowing me to speak to you today. Thank you, Russ, for inviting me back. After last time, I guess I didn't mess it up too badly, so I appreciate that. When Russ first approached me about doing encouraging words this time around, my intent was to do something kind of lighthearted and fluffy. But it occurred to me as I kept thinking about it that these are heavy times that we're living in right now. And I thought it would be nice good to try to explore some of that. When I was growing up, one of the verses that I felt was most pertinent in my life was in Matthew 22, where it says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's." I always felt that was allowed for a good framework of how we comport our lives as people of faith with our civic responsibilities as members of a society. But those lines seem to be getting more and more blurred these days, and it concerns me. It feels that we're becoming more and more a nation divided. And it didn't just start with the last election we had. This has been growing for quite a while now. And it culminated to some degree in November when, after the election, millions of people woke up very happy, and then millions of people woke up very sad. And they have not yet been able to reconcile those differences yet. So that we don't talk to each other, we're not communicating with each other, we're going to our own corners when it comes to where we get our information. It's to the point now where not only do our opinions differ, but even our facts are different now. And that's very concerning. I think that it also leads us to be in a world where we have to ask ourselves, what is our role in this? How do we deal with this? What is the Christian way to do? So the subject I had was a survivor's guide to a nation divided. But I think next, the question is, what's the Christian guide to a nation divided? What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to deal with these problems that we see? If you turn on the news every day, if you go to websites, if you pick up the paper, it's clear that we are in troubled times. Not that this hasn't happened before. And you know what? We're a great country. We'll get through this again. But it's getting more and more challenging, I think. Next slide. We all remember back in the 90s when the question became WWJD. What would Jesus do, as Justin mentioned earlier today? What would Jesus do if he were here today? And while this was kind of a fashion fad, as it turned out, because a lot of people who wore these bracelets or who wore the t-shirts that had WWJD on it didn't necessarily do what they thought Jesus would do, it still became something that was part of the American psyche for a while, and at least raised the question. So the question becomes not what would Jesus do, but as we deal with what's going on in society today, I think a question has to be, what did Jesus do? What was his guidance? If he were here today, how would he approach some of the things that are going on today? So I wanted to pick a few examples from the New Testament of things, situations that might have some bearing on where we are today in life. The first one is when Jesus was encountered by the adulteress. He was brought before him was a woman who had committed adultery. And it was intended to be one of the great gotcha moments of world history, where they would bring this woman to Jesus and try to catch him up in something. When he was asked what should be done with this woman, as we all recall, the response was, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." What that moment said to me was that Jesus was more concerned about the humanity of this person than condemning what she had done. And the question as we go forward with what would Jesus do and what did Jesus do is asking, how do we relate to that? If we encounter people whose lifestyle, sexually or otherwise, we may disagree with, is the first thing we do condemn them or look at their humanity and try to build on that going forward? The next case was how we deal with people who are different from us. And the great example of that to me is in Luke with the story of the Good Samaritan. We all know that story from childhood, where the traveler was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was attacked and beat up and left by the side of the road for dead. And a priest walked by him, a Levite went by him, yet a man from Samaria, a place that was looked down upon in the first century world, where people were not regarded as being equal to everyone else. This man was the one who stopped, who treated the man, who took him to lodging and took care of him. So what does that say about us in the way we treat people who are different from us, or who may be somebody that we haven't encountered before? If we were to pass by a refugee or an immigrant, how would we respond? Or somebody who's from Samaria? Do we do the same thing that Jesus teaches us to do? To reach out to that person and to heal and bind their wounds before deciding how we deal with them on a political level? The next thing that occurred to me was how Jesus talked about children and how we deal with that. Some children to Jesus, and some of them thought that that was a distraction from him, that he shouldn't be bothering with children right there. And he said to them, "Let the children come to me." Now, of course, I grew up in a King James Version world where the word was, "Suffer the children to come to me," and I couldn't understand why you would have children suffer to come to you. But as I figured out that was just King James talking, we can get beyond that. But it was clear that the message was that children are important to our future. The children mean something. The children are people we have to take care of. So I would argue that that means that even in taking a pro-life stance, pro-life does not end at the womb. That children continue to thrive and live. We need to take care of them. We need to take care of children whose parents don't love them, whose parents neglect them, whose parents are not parents in the true sense of the word. How do we as Christians live a life where we reach out to those people, those children, because Jesus told us to let the children come to us? So the question is how we take these episodes, because there are many other ones in the New Testament that I think we can look at as well. But how do we take those incidents and apply them to our lives? Next slide. I would suggest that there is a clue to how we can do that. Now, as Russ mentioned, I am the son of a preacher, and preachers have a tendency to take letters from their points and make them into a word. I've done that for you today. We're going to look at the word clue and try to figure out how those letters can play into our lives. So next slide. First is about communication, talking to each other, not talking at each other. How do we engage people who may think differently from us and try to engage them in what we're trying to communicate to them? The next step would be to listen. It's not just enough to talk to each other, but we have to listen to each other as people. We have to kind of see what the other point of view is in order to understand how we can best deal with that. I think that the next thing we need to look at is understanding where that comes from. Because without listening, there is no understanding. And I think that it's important for us to try to make that point as we go through this maelstrom of discord and discontent that we're seeing in the world today. And lastly, I think that the issue is about empathy. And empathy is the most important one, because it takes being willing to step into someone else's shoes, to step into someone else's skin, and try to look at life from their perception. I've never had to go to the point where I don't know where my next meal is coming from. I've never had to commit a crime because I had to feed my children. There are people who go through life episodes that they never intended to go through, but yet that's where they are. And we need to understand before we go out and try to condemn them and make them the lesser, to try to understand why they're doing what they're doing and how they got to the point that they're doing it. I think that those things will help give us the beginning of the process. Because here's the deal. We are living in a world right now where people have taken to the streets like they haven't done in years. That people are saying that if my guy or my team does something, it's right. But if the other team does the same thing, it's wrong. We can't do that. And it's not going to get any better anytime soon. We're about to enter a legislative session in this state that who knows what's going to come out of that and what kind of disputes will come from that. We're about to head into a municipal election here in the largest city in Alabama, in Birmingham, this summer. Another chance for discord and despondency. Next year, there will be statewide elections going on in the state, in addition to congressional elections. And if it hasn't started already, the race for the White House in 2020 is beginning soon. Disturbing, I know, and kind of depressing in a lot of ways, but that's what we have to deal with. So it's our duty as Christians, I believe, to try to bridge the gaps, to try to engage in conversation, to try not to resort to our silos, not to read the web pages that agree with us, or watch the cable news channels that agree with us, or listen to the talk radio that agrees with us, without trying to encourage ourselves to see that there's another side to the story. I think that being in the news business is not as honorable a profession as it might have been once for many people, but I think there's one thing that I kind of learned from that, and that was the ability to try to look at both sides of the story. Because in order to be fair and honest, you have to do that. And I would suggest that that's not only a journalistic principle, but it's also a Christian principle. So, if I were to leave you with encouraging words today, there would be two. One is the basic one that I think is the core of who we are. It is, as Jesus said, the second greatest commandment, loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about compassion. It's about feeling for other people. There are many episodes of that we see in the Bible already. Everything from the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And in 1 John 4, there's the reference to how can you say you love God and hate your brother? Because if you say that, you're a liar, because you've never seen God, but you've seen your brother. We see our brothers and sisters every day. Sometimes we ignore them. Sometimes we can't see them for our own blinders. But I would suggest that we do that to understand why we are where we are and how we can get out of it. The last point being that it's not about doing what we think should be done, but what would Jesus do? What did Jesus do? And how can that make us better people? I am encouraged by those thoughts. I am encouraged by the fact that we are Americans, we can get through a lot of things. But I'm mostly encouraged by the fact that we are Christians. And that means that we are to strive for better. And with that, I encourage you to be the kinds of Christians who would do what Jesus did. Thank you.